First, a very warm thanks, where is Rosa, to Rosa Sessa for this chance to be part of this wonderful city and to be part of this exciting conference. As some of you know, it was a city Venturi loved, even if his, can you hear me? Is it okay, the sound? Okay. It was a city Venturi loved, even if his dear and brilliant friend, Everett Goyer from Princeton, did not, the first quote. But from what I could tell from the Penn archives, Venturi visited Naples at least 3 times while he was staying at the Academy. After his, this is in the mid-50s, after his first trip, writing his parents about the delicious mandarins in season there. His mother was always trying to urge him to eat fruit. And in a letter to Hamilton Smith, one of the partners at Breuer's office, Venturi refers, shortly before his departure from the Academy, and undoubtedly with considerable hyperbole, living there. I don't know if that meant 2 weeks or what. However, beginning this talk, I just have so many people to thank, many of whom are in this room, but I want to mention especially, and please read all the names, Frida Graham, who inspired me to actually see the 2 houses I'll show at the end of the talk. And also, I want to just say, how much my work also relates to that of Denise Costanzo, who covered some of this territory before me. And I'm also grateful especially to Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi, especially Denise, for spending so much time with me over the years, talking about their work and lives, and it's a real honor to be part of this event. Today, I'm going to speak about a dimension of Bob Venturi's work that has received somewhat less scholarly attention than other facets of his work. That is, his interest in ideas of tradition and vernacular architecture and how this interest influenced his early residential designs. Much has been written about his and Denise Scott Brown's groundbreaking work on mass culture, namely the Las Vegas Strip and Levittown, for which Denise was in so many ways the impetus and inspiration. I shall focus instead on a few early sources that were important to Venturi's interest in tradition and American domestic architecture. Sources, paradoxically, 2 of which he discovered during his time in Rome as a fellow at the American Academy from 1954 to 56, with some intermittent trips back to the States. Venturi's interest in history and tradition, of course, predates his time in Rome in the mid-50s. His debts to Jean Labitu and Donald Drew Egbert, his teachers at Princeton, are well known, and both were critical to his interest in architectural history and to his deep appreciation of architecture beyond modernism. There were, of course, other influential sources that he was exposed to before his years at the Academy, notably Louis Kahn, his reading of T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, cited in his Rome Prize application, and which I'll return to shortly, and the Architectural Review, which he read regularly, and where he published in the Townscape section his first article, an excerpt from his Princeton master's thesis on contextualism, discussing Michelangelo's Capitoline Hill. Undoubtedly, he perused Gordon Cullen and Ivor de Wolf, whose real name was Hubert de Kroning Hastings, articles on townscape and Italian hill towns. And as a parenthetical note, I should have showed you, here's some townscape. Cullen also included signage and advertising in his series and later book on townscape. Architectural Review was one of the first professional magazines to regularly report on vernacular architecture, both traditional and contemporary, as they called it, outside of Europe, including South Africa already in the 40s. But probably more important to Venturi, it was also one of the first journals to embrace commercial architecture vernacular, even if it wasn't yet called such. Notably, its competition and issue on the English pub in 1949. But back to Rome. Tradition, Eliot, Rogers, and Frank Lloyd Wright. As I just mentioned, and I'm sure most of you in this room already know, Venturi had long been fascinated with Eliot's 1917 essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. This debt is clearly announced in the preface to Complexity and Contradiction, where he quotes Eliot at length. I won't read you the whole quote, but just to underscore, one section says, tradition, it involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole literature of Europe is contained. I always assumed that Venturi first discovered this essay, like many of the literary sources in Complexity and Contradiction, from a freshman English course in Princeton. But instead, as he explained to me, they were from his other close Princeton buddy, Philip Finkelpearl, who became an important literary critic and professor of English literature, and would remain one of his closest friends until Finkelpearl's death. And here you see in one of Finkelpearl's own studies a reference to Eliot. Tradition, while rarely used in the European interwar polemics of the modern movement, was not, however, such a foreign word to architecture in the English-speaking world. Henry Russell Hitchcock, whom Venturi often cited, referred to the new tradition as early as 1929 in his early book on modern architecture. And as Denise Costanzo has noted, the word was also in the subtitle of Gideon's book, Space, Time, and Architecture, which he obviously read at Princeton, but also cited later. However, when I began thinking about this talk, I was immediately struck how close Venturi's ideas about tradition and his use of Eliot were to those of Ernesto Rogers, who only 1 year before Venturi's arrival at the Academy had relaunched Casa Bella, now with the telling new title, Casa Bella Continuità, and forgive my Italian pronunciation throughout. This past spring, I went to the archives at Penn, hoping to find a link, and not remembering, much to my embarrassment, that Denise Costanzo and Martino Stirley had already discussed Rogers in their essays on Venturi. But I found in the archives, just like these two scholars had, Venturi's acknowledgement of Rogers in some of his letters. Rogers was a visiting critic at the Academy, and Venturi writes to his parents about an inspiring trip with Rogers to Tarquinia, on another occasion about going with him to the airport to pick up Perasutti, who had been teaching at Princeton, and all dining together. In another letter, Venturi enthusiastically reports to his parents that Rogers read his manuscript, or the manuscript he had just finished, Hillbrows and Hilltowns, and says, quote, he likes it, and might publish it in Casabella. These are, of course, only snippets of a connection between the accomplished Italian architect and the young Venturi. But what was perhaps most kind of suggestive to me was Venturi's acknowledgement of Roger's importance to him in a letter he wrote after his return to the States to the chair of the Academy's Board of Trustees, someone named James Killam Smith, saying, "I owe a special debt to Ernesto Rogers there for his friendship and his introduction to the best of a current Italian architecture." One suspects it may well have been Rogers who introduced him to the work of Albini, Gardella, and Moretti, the latter whose Casa del Rizzoli Venturi later cited as a precedent for his mother's house. But I would also like to suggest that Rogers, and I'm admittedly speculating a little here, may have also enriched his thinking about tradition and encouraged him to think about it not only in terms of high art or professional architecture, but to consider also the nature of locale and nationality in considering tradition. This may have happened simply in conversations. Rogers spoke English, but it also very likely may have been a result of Venturi's reading of the Italian editorials, if in the supplement of the English translations that accompanied the first issues of Casabella Continuità. Venturi did know some Italian, but as he complains to his parents, he really needed to work on it. Shortly after he arrived at the Academy, he writes home to his parents that he's spending time in the library trying to get caught up on periodicals and get stimulated. Rogers, probably more than any architect of the period, thought and wrote eloquently about tradition, undoubtedly struggling with the legacy of fascist architecture, and he was partly complicit before the late 30s, and of Italy's own rich historical past. He writes in the opening editorial titled Continuità, "No work is truly modern which is not genuinely rooted in tradition, while no ancient work has a modern meaning which is not capable of somehow reflecting our modern temper. Thus, avoiding the extremes of traditionalism and idealism, we can examine architecture as it actually is in reality." It is clear that by invoking tradition, Rogers is not endorsing historical imitation or direct replication, and he explicitly decries demagogic folklorism, just as he will anodyne cosmopolitanism and retrograde revolutionaries like Venturi. He loves alliteration. But what he does advocate, and for me this resonates with Venturi's own position, is both artistic freedom and a conscious awareness of the context in which we operate. In other words, the right to be original and different, true to one's own creative impulses, but always with the consciousness of history and region. Rogers will frequently use the word freedom, a word in post-fascist Italy of the 50s, undoubtedly with both a political and aesthetic resonance. But even more striking to me, my next editorial, initially titled Pretext for a Non-Formalist Criticism, Rogers, in English, quotes a passage from T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, quite different actually from the one used by Venturi. Every nation has not only its own creative capacities, but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of the critical habits than of those of its creative genius. When Rogers republishes his editorial in his book of 1958, he in fact retitles it Tradition and the Individual Talent, underscoring his debts to Eliot. Rogers seems to be making 2 points in the quotation he chose, ones that would govern his own approach to design. First, that tradition has a national or regional meaning. And second, that this tradition can't be accepted uncritically, that ingrained habits of mind lead to blind spots and errors of judgment. Tradition for Rogers was thus a dynamic process. Curiously, the editorial is mostly about Brazilian architecture, an explicit refutation of Max Bill's recent attack, arguing that despite moments of frivolity, contemporary Brazilian architecture, mostly Niemeyer, represented a compelling synthesis of regional character founded in tradition and individual creativity. Again, tradition doesn't mean conservative repetition. And the title of his editorial of the August-September 1954 issue, shortly before Venturi's arrival at Rome, was, as I mentioned, Our Responsibilities to Tradition. Rogers, like Venturi later, is not renouncing functionalism, but rather a narrow conception of it, arguing that it must encompass a work's cultural and social context. Aesthetic novelty, originality is no longer a value in itself. Now to turn to the next name in my subtitle, Wright, someone who might seem so alien to Venturi's later sensibility. Wright was, of course, on the minds of many in Italy after World War II, especially owing to Bruno Zevi's passionate promotion of the architect's work, again, almost as a counter to fascist architecture of the 30s. Wright was also an architect Rogers would pay homage to, devoting a whole later issue, a Casa Bella, to his recent work. However, Venturi's interest in Wright, like his fascination with Eliot, predates his time in Rome. In fact, he often cites an early high school fascination with Frank Lloyd Wright. While he was working for Oscar Stoneroff in Philadelphia in 1950, Venturi helped design the traveling Wright exhibition, 60 Years of Living Architecture, which would open the following year in Florence. While at the Academy, he completed the article I mentioned earlier, Hillbrows and Hilltowns, a comparison of Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin designs with Italian hill towns, in which Venturi argues that Wright's approach to architecture and landscape was indebted to his experience of the Etruscan landscape of 1910-11. And here are some photos that he admits to Rogers are not the greatest, that he hopes to replace with better ones. Perhaps even more curiously, Venturi presents Wright as an advocate of tradition, not something I associate with Wright, a tradition if one integrally tied to the present. Here he quotes two comments made by Wright in 1954. I won't read them here, but basically Wright, perhaps because of a Venice project, is stressing tradition. As I mentioned early, he submitted this essay to Ernesto Rogers for potential publication in Casa Bella, but also to Ian McCullum at the Architectural Review. It was not accepted at either publication. Vernacular architecture. But this article, that is the unpublished manuscript which Venturi completed at the Academy, brings up another subject that would become so central to his residential work in the 1970s, the vernacular. Like Igor de Wolf and other architects of the period, in his manuscript, he celebrates the Italian hill towns, writing that the medieval hill towns of central Italy represent a peak in Western art. One suspects he knew already, given his focus on Wright's time in Italy, Wright's own passage in the Vossmuth edition, where Wright says the true basis for any serious study of the art of architecture still lies in those indigenous, more humble buildings everywhere which are to art and architecture what folklore is to literature and folk song to music, and which very few architects are concerned. During his stay at the Academy, Venturi traveled extensively, and like Wright before him, and like so many modern architects, he was moved by everyday buildings and spaces, taking photos of these spaces and writing home letters about them, more frequently, I might add, than almost about the buildings he would later publish in Complexity and Contradiction. He did, however, include in that famous volume 3 photos rarely discussed of Italian anonymous buildings, which, like most of the images in his book, were taken from a published source, maybe one he found in the Academy Library. But it's a beautiful book, by the way. In a letter to his parents, for example, he writes after a trip to Abruzzi, beautiful, unspoiled hill towns, despite the poverty there, and almost the same sentiments about Bazzano, one of the poorest places I have seen, with donkeys, chickens, and sheep all walking around in the muddy, unpaved streets and piazza, but it was beautiful. And again, Rogers might have been an inspiration or influence. Rogers frequently pays homage to Pagano's 1937 exhibition, Architettura Rurale, and publishes images of vernacular architecture, the truly in southern Italy, but also photos from the French Tam-Tams group's study of the Cameroons. But in contrast to Pagano and some of the early masters of the modern movement, Rogers' interest in the vernacular, and he would not use this word, more common in the English-speaking world, but spontaneous, folk, or rural, is less about its functionalism or its aesthetic simplicity than about its integral ties to a culture and tradition. In the editorial, The Responsibilities to Tradition, that I just showed you, he pays homage to the poet Rocco Scotellaro from Matera, who recently died tragically at 30, whom he compares to Alvar Aalto, explaining that Scotellaro, who rose from his humble peasant background to speak of cultural ideas of world resonance, whereas Aalto, a sophisticated cosmopolitan architect, represented a reverse path, seeking to express regional culture from a broader European perspective. For Rogers, a consciousness of the vernacular, like tradition, and for him the two were integrally tied, did not again imply replication, but was one aspect of creating an architecture reflecting historical reality. In other words, an architecture that was more than the dogmatic formalism and universalism that he now associated with so much modern architecture. And I think the parallels with Venturi are easily apparent. But how does this relate to Venturi's own work? How does he make the leap from Italian vernacular buildings to an American context? And again, the answer paradoxically comes again in Rome. In a letter to Louis Kahn, during his last stay in Rome, he wrote, "My reading, surprisingly enough, has centered on Vincent Scully's shingle-style book, dealing with the domestic work, as you probably know, of Richardson, early McKim, Mead and White, and also Philadelphia's Wilson Eyre of the 80s, He deals with an idiom very familiar in suburban Philadelphia, of course, which I have not especially appreciated before, and in the beginnings of a strong tradition relevant to which we must learn from, air is the bottom left. It makes you see also the early work of Wright differently. Scully's book is not primarily about vernacular architecture, but as its title suggests, self-consciously designed buildings by professional architects. But it is very much about the heritage of American vernacular buildings, and he includes a few images such as these, and the influence it had on American architects striking to create a native idiom appropriate to building traditions and conventions in the United States, but also indisputably modern. Scully quotes various 19th century critics whose language surprisingly echoes some of the same issues that Rogers will raise. And again, no time to read these quotations, but I think what's important to note is that the emphasis on local laws is associated too with modernity and modernism. What I would like to suggest in these remaining few minutes is that these various ideas that were so much a part of Venturi's intellectual discovery in Rome, tradition, vernacular building, and the importance of an American or local identity, were part of what shaped Venturi's approach to two of his most iconic house projects of the 1970s, modest commissions in New England, both attributed to Venturi and Roach. Venturi was, according to the clients, very much the hands-on designer. The first was for the island of Nantucket, Massachusetts, and it's really a double project, the Trubuck and Wislaki houses, 1970 to 72, and the second, a guest house, a house and a guest house garage on Block Island, Rhode Island, the Cox Hayden studio houses. These designs were a product of a complex web of ideas, but perhaps can be seen, at least in part, as a product of his years in Rome. The Nantucket design, perhaps of all his domestic designs, reflects his reading of Scully's shingle style. The commission, in fact, comes directly from his association with Scully, whom Venturi had gotten to know while teaching at Yale. Vince's wife, Marion LaFollette, was editing the manuscript of Complexity and Contradiction. Parenthetically, I might note the Scullys themselves lived in a vernacular shingle-style house. One of Marion's closest friends was Louise Trubuck, there in the middle, the wife of a young law professor at Yale, Dave Trubuck. Marion proposed to Louise that the Trubucks consider buying land on Nantucket, where she herself had a summer house, at that time not the posh retreat of the very rich, and Vince recommended the young couple hire Bob Venturi. Louise's sister also joined them in buying an isolated stretch of land on the shore of Nantucket. The result was these two iconic houses with Lockett plans and elevations on the top, Trubuck below, and we'll hear more about this later today. The influence of the shingle style, I think, is striking. The cedar shingles, pitched roofs, and deep porches, unusually shaped windows with occasional Palladian inflections and intricate interior details. Here's some shingle-style houses that may have partly sparked ideas. But in contrast to the sprawling cottages of McKim, Mead, and White, these are small houses. This Wislaki house is minuscule, and they also pay homage to the island's vernacular, especially as Venturi notes, the 19th century fishing village known as Sconset. And here are a couple of old photos of how the village must have looked when he first visited. And here one of just one house in its highly manicured state, probably going for a couple million. But as one might guess, this now prim homogeneity which characterizes the village was mandated by a strict zoning code which had just been implemented. And indeed, the design of the two houses required great labor in Eliot's sense and much frustration to finally pass the review board. But like Rogers, Venturi's tradition is not static. It permits, requires invention. Note the overscaled windows and asymmetrical composition. In the Trubach inside, there's a curved wall and a crank stair. Venturi himself referred to them as a synthesis of shingle style and Nantucket fishermen's cottages, but also described them as, quote, two little temples on the plain by the sea of Selinute, presumably due to their studied misalignment. The same mixture of sources, but now with another local inflection, can be seen in Venturi's design of the Cox Hayden House and Guest Garage House on Block Island, designed in 1979, completed in 81, which I was urged to visit, as I mentioned, by Frida Graham. I hardly knew about this house, despite its contemporary publicity. And if anything, these two structures are more modest and more inventive than the Trubach Wislaki houses. The main house is again very tiny, almost like a little ship's cabin, much smaller than the average Levittown house. The client, Weld Cox, an author and management consultant to architects, gave Venturi 11-page program, but its basic instruction was keep it simple and make it architecture, something Venturi accomplished with amazing ingenuity, even if Cox's son, Don, said it was a bitch to build. The pitch, as in the Low House, is contrary to standard American frame construction, nor were the idiosyncratic windows, some detached from the floors, by any means ordinary. I have a lot of trouble with the idea of the ordinary window when it comes to Venturi. Block Island is still an old-fashioned, unpretentious place. And somehow Venturi captured this unpretentious quality beautifully, still making architecture. And once more, vernacular did not mean imitation, but allowed for wit and invention. Cedar shingles and traditional wide painted floorboards, like traditional beach cottages and rural bungalows, but windows span floors and cabinet profiles drawn by Venturi on site with yellow trace take whimsical forms. Tradition was not paralysis, nor was it strictly shingle style. I'd like to conclude with a note, now framed and hanging on the wall, that Venturi wrote Weld and Mary about the built-in shelving you just saw, a kind of open linen closet. Dear Mary and Weld, I hope this is okay. I just couldn't make it look good with the enclosed upper cabinet. I think white towels, they didn't quite follow his rules, and Clorox bottles could look good, exposed, if neat, as quasi-pop art. Oh, I lost my last page, but I will just say, the clients were very happy, as were the Trubach and Wislaki clients. And for me, I would like to say this wasn't just ordinary architecture, but I prefer Venturi's later phrase, ordinary as extraordinary. Thank you.